Somebody get this dirty old black beggar off my lawn before he embarrasses my bride!
Preston Calloway sneered loudly, snapping his fingers in the air as he aggressively stepped into the personal space of the quiet, elderly man. Preston looked at the old man's scuffed shoes and faded suit, letting out a cruel, mocking laugh that echoed across the elite plantation wedding.
Look at you. Did you wrap your pathetic little wedding gift in a brown grocery bag? You probably drive a forklift for a living, old man. So don't think your cheap skin belongs anywhere near my high-class guests. Security, drag this clown out of here right now!
The 64-year-old black man stood completely motionless, his rough hands tightly clutching the small package. He didn't scream, and he didn't fight back, as two large guards violently grabbed his arms and began dragging him backward across the manicured grass. As he was pushed away, the brown paper package slipped from his hands, hitting the marble fountain. A cheap, worn, $19 gold wedding band rolled out and sank straight into the muddy water. Preston laughed harder, nudging the old man's handwritten letter with the toe of his expensive shoe.
Leave it in the mud. It's junk, just like him.
But what this arrogant groom didn't realize, what would completely destroy his life in exactly 43 minutes, was that this beggar owned the massive corporation Preston worked for, signed his paychecks, and was worth over $3 billion. Welcome back to Black Stories, where arrogance meets absolute justice. Today, we bring you an unforgettable tale of power reversal, human dignity, and the ultimate corporate reckoning. If you believe that a person's true worth is measured by their character, not their clothes, hit that subscribe button right now. Let's dive deep into how a billionaire ended up being treated like garbage before turning his abuser's entire world upside down. To understand how a man worth $3 billion ended up being dragged across a lawn like trash, you have to understand who Solomon Hartwell really was. Because nobody at that wedding had the faintest idea, not one single person in that crowd of 300 knew that the quiet old man in the cheap gray suit was about to become the most powerful person any of them had ever stood next to. Solomon Hartwell was born in 1962 in a tin-roofed house on the wrong side of a railroad track in Sumter County, South Carolina. He was the seventh of 9 children, born into a town where a black boy's future was decided the day he was born, and almost never in his favor. The kind of town where the back door was the only door, where a child learned the rules of survival before he learned to read. His father, Eli Hartwell, hauled freight and dug graves and did whatever else a man could do with his back when the world refused to pay him for his mind. His mother, Ruth, took in other people's laundry, pressed other people's Sunday clothes, and raised 9 children on faith, grits, and a flat refusal to let any one of them believe the lie the world was telling them about who they were. You are not what they call you. Ruth Hartwell told her children every single morning before school. She would grip each child's chin, on a one, so they had to look her dead in the eye. You are what God made you, and God does not make junk. Solomon carried that sentence his entire life. He would carry it onto that lawn. 60 years later, straight into the teeth of a man who looked at him and saw exactly the kind of junk Ruth Hartwell had spent her whole life teaching her children they were not. He was a quiet boy, watchful. He learned early that a poor black child in the rural South survived on his ability to read a room before the room read him. To know who was dangerous and who was kind, to know who held the power, and exactly how that power moved through a space. It was a skill that would one day make him one of the most feared negotiators in American industry. But at 12 years old, it was simply the thing that kept him alive. He was also, it turned out, extraordinary with numbers. Not in the loud, showy way. In the deep way, he could look at a thing, a freight route, a fuel cost, a stack of competing bids, and see the whole shape of it at once. The way most people see a human face. A teacher named Mrs. Delphine Carver noticed it when he was 14. She started leaving advanced math books on his desk without a word. The way you quietly leave water out for something wild, you are trying to keep alive. She never told him to be grateful. She just kept the books coming. He worked his way through a state college on a janitor's wages and a scholarship that covered exactly half of what he needed. He slept 4 hours a night and mopped the floors of the same business school building where he could not afford to take a single class for credit. He would finish mopping at 2 in the morning, and then he would sit alone in the dark. In the back of the empty lecture halls, working through the equations he had copied off the boards before he cleaned them. A poor black janitor, teaching himself the business that would one day make him a giant. In a room he was only allowed to enter with a mop in his hand. That was the beginning. But the thing that built the man, the thing that became the heart of everything he ever made, was a woman named Eleanor. He married Eleanor Brooks in 1986. He was 24 years old, dead broke, and proposing with a ring he had bought for $19 from a pawn shop. 2 towns over, it was a thin gold band. So cheap, the gold practically wore off. If you breathed on it, he got down on one knee on the steps of her mother's church, and he said, "Eleanor, I have got nothing in this world but a head full of numbers and a heart full of you, and I am asking you to bet on both." Eleanor Brooks looked at that $19 ring. She looked at that broke young man kneeling on the church steps, and she said the words that became the bedrock of everything Solomon Hartwell ever built. "I am not betting on your money, Solomon. I am betting on your character. And your character is the richest thing I have ever seen. Remember that ring? Remember those words? Because in about 38 years, a man in a tuxedo is going to throw that exact ring into a muddy fountain and call it junk. And he is going to find out, the hardest way a man can find anything out, exactly how wrong he was about what it was worth. Eleanor wore that $19 ring for 31 years. She wore it when they had nothing. She wore it when Solomon started a 1-truck freight operation in 1991. With a vehicle he bought at a county auction and repaired himself in a rented garage with his own 2 hands. She wore it when that 1 truck became 3, and then 12, and then a fleet. She wore it when the freight company became a logistics company, and the logistics company became a holding company. And Solomon Hartwell, the boy from the tin-roofed house, built, brick by brick, over 40 years, an industrial and infrastructure empire called the Meridian Sterling Group by the time Solomon Hartwell turned 60. Meridian Sterling moved freight and built bridges and ran shipping ports and owned warehouses in 31 states. It employed more than 40,000 people. Its name was on highway overpasses and shipping manifests across half the country. And the man whose signature sat on the company's founding charter was worth, by the most conservative estimate his own people could put together, a little over $3 billion. And here is the strange part. You have probably never heard his name. That was not an accident. That was a 40-year decision. Because Solomon Hartwell had watched what money does to people. He watched it, the very moment he could afford to watch it. He saw how a person's face changed the second they found out who he was, how the handshake got firmer, and the smile got wider, and the truth got further and further away. He had built an empire on his ability to read what people actually wanted from him. And the day he became rich, he discovered that the thing most people wanted from him was a piece, and they would say almost anything, become almost anyone, to get it. So he disappeared. Not from the company. He ran that with an iron grip from a corner office. Almost nobody ever got to see. He disappeared from the world. He never gave interviews. He turned down every magazine cover, every richest men in America list, every gala where the entire point was to be seen and admired. He drove a 10-year-old sedan. He wore his suits until the elbows wore clean through. He lived in the same modest brick house in a middle-class neighborhood outside Charleston that he had bought back in 1994. The year the company first turned real money, and he never moved out of it. Not once. Not in all the decades that followed. Most of his own executives had never met him face to face. They knew the chairman the way you know the weather. A force that shaped everything, that decided everything, that you respected and feared, but had never actually laid eyes on. The company ran day to day under a president and chief executive named Marcus Aldridge, a sharp, fiercely loyal, deeply principled man. Solomon had pulled up off the loading dock 30 years earlier and trusted with his life. Marcus was the face of the company. Solomon was the foundation underneath it. And Solomon liked it exactly that way. But the deepest reason Solomon Hartwell hid his fortune had nothing to do with himself at all. It was about a little girl. Eleanor Brooks Hartwell died in 2017. On a Tuesday in October, in the same modest brick house she had shared with Solomon for 23 years. It was cancer. It took her slowly, the way it takes the strong ones. And Solomon Hartwell, a man who could stare down a hostile board, a man who had broken business rivals, who outweighed him 10-1, sat on the edge of that bed for the last 3 weeks of her life and could not save the one thing he would have given every single dollar he owned to keep. She slipped the $19 ring off her finger 2 days before the end. When her hands had gotten too thin to hold it, she pressed it into his palm, and she closed his rough fingers over it. "You give this to Imani," she whispered. "When she finds a man worth her character, not her money. She doesn't know about the money, Solomon. And you keep it that way as long as you possibly can. You give her this ring when she finds a man who would love her if she had nothing in this world. Promise me." He promised, and keeping that promise would turn out to be the hardest thing he ever did. Imani Hartwell was their only child, born in 1996. When Eleanor was 40 years old, and the doctors had long since told them it would never happen, they named her Imani, which means faith, because she was the impossible thing made real. And from the day she was born, Solomon and Eleanor made a decision that would have horrified every other billionaire in America. They did not tell her. Imani Hartwell grew up believing her father owned a small trucking and shipping business. That was true. In the same way, it is true that the ocean is some water. She grew up in that modest brick house. She wore clothes from the regular store. She got a part-time job at 16, scooping ice cream, because her father told her, with a perfectly straight face, that money did not grow on trees, and she would appreciate her own paycheck more than his. She took out student loans for college. Student loans. The only daughter of a billionaire. Because Solomon Hartwell wanted his child to understand the exact weight of the thing she was carrying, and then he paid those loans off himself, quietly, the week after she graduated, and never told her he had done it. She thought they were comfortable, solidly middle class, a nice house, a good life, and a father who drove an old car and clipped coupons and worked long hours at a freight company. She became a music teacher, a public school music teacher, 4th and 5th grade, in a district where half the kids qualified for free lunch, and most of them had never touched an instrument in their lives until Miss Brooks put a recorder, or a second-hand violin, or a borrowed trumpet into their hands, and showed them they could make something beautiful out of nothing. She used her mother's maiden name, Brooks, partly to honor Eleanor, and partly because, though she never fully understood why, her father had always gently encouraged it. She had no idea that the name change was one more quiet layer of protection, one more wall between his daughter and the fortune he was determined would never decide who loved her. Solomon Hartwell would have walked straight into traffic for that girl. And now you understand the trap he had built for himself. Because the single hardest thing he ever did, harder than the company, harder than burying Eleanor, was to keep his promise, keep the secret, let his daughter live a normal life, and be loved, if she was loved, for exactly who she was, which brings us, finally, to Preston Calloway. Imani met Preston 18 months before the wedding, at a fundraiser for the school music program. It was one of the rare occasions when her two worlds brushed up against each other. Because Preston Calloway was the kind of young executive who showed up at charity events specifically to be photographed writing checks. The Calloways were old money. The kind of old money that, in the South, comes with a very long shadow. The family had owned land in the Low Country since before the Civil War, and everyone understood, without ever saying it out loud, exactly what that land had been used for, and exactly who had been forced to work it. Over the generations, the Calloways had laundered that inheritance into respectability, banking, real estate, a state Senate seat held by Preston's father, Harrison Calloway, a smooth, silver-haired man who could quote scripture at a prayer breakfast on Sunday morning and gut a rival without changing his expression by Monday afternoon. Preston was 32 years old, handsome in the polished, hollow way of a man who has never once in his entire life been told no. He had a jaw like a magazine advertisement, and the easy confidence of someone who had been handed every door already standing open, and who genuinely believed he had kicked every one of them down himself. He went to the right schools because his father had given those schools buildings. He landed a good job because his father knew the right people. And the job, this is the part that matters. This is the hinge the entire story turns on. The job Preston Calloway had landed. The job he bragged about at every dinner party. The job, whose title he wore like a crown, was Senior Vice President of Corporate Development at a major industrial holding company, the Meridian Sterling Group. Preston Calloway worked for Solomon Hartwell, and he had absolutely no idea. How could he? He was 3 layers deep in a 40,000-person company. He had never met the chairman, because almost nobody ever had. He knew the name Hartwell, the way everyone at Meridian Sterling knew it. A name on the lobby wall, a signature on the founding charter, a reclusive old founder, rumored to be either a genius or a ghost. To Preston, the chairman was a legend, an abstraction, a man so far above his world that the two would obviously never, ever intersect. And the woman Preston was marrying went by Imani Brooks, a public school music teacher. Ina modest kar, from a modest house, with a father who ran some little trucking company. Preston had met that father exactly twice, both times briefly, both times treating the quiet old man with the bland, dismissive politeness you would show a fiancé's accountant. Let that settle in for a second. Preston Calloway had looked Solomon Hartwell directly in the face on 2 separate occasions and seen absolutely nothing. He had seen a poor old man. He had seen, frankly, an embarrassment. A low-rent father-in-law he would have to manage and minimize. A stain on the kind of glittering wedding the Calloways fully expected to throw. He had no idea he was looking at his own boss's boss. He had no idea the little trucking company had 40,000 employees. He had no idea that the quiet man he was already privately planning how to keep out of the family photographs was the same man who signed his paycheck. He was about to find out, in front of 300 people, on a Saturday afternoon, on a lawn that had once been a plantation. But first, he was going to do the thing that would end him. The wedding was held at a place called Belcourt. And if you have never been to the low country of South Carolina, you have to understand what a place like Belcourt actually is. It is a former plantation. 200 acres of ancient oak trees, dripping with Spanish moss. A white-columned antebellum mansion sitting at the end of a half-mile drive. Fumate gardens. Marble fountains. A long, reflecting pool. In the modern South, places like Belcourt have been scrubbed clean and rebranded as historic estates and rented out for upward of $80,000 a day to people who want their wedding to look like a magazine spread, and who do not think too hard about whose suffering built those white columns. The Calloways chose it on purpose. It was their kind of place. It said everything they wanted said about the family their son was lowering himself to marry into. Or rather, the family they imagined was lucky to be marrying up into theirs. 300 guests. A who's who of low-country wealth and political power, senators and bankers, and the silver-haired aristocracy of a world that still, to this very day, quietly measured a man by his bloodline and his bank account. The women in couture, the men in custom morning coats, champagne flowing before noon, a string quartet playing on the veranda, and over all of it, the soft gold light of a perfect southern afternoon falling on the lawn of a place that had been built by people the guests' own great-great-grandparents had once owned. Solomon Hartwell drove himself there. Think about that. He could have arrived by helicopter. He could have come in a motorcade. He could have bought Belcourt outright that very morning, with the petty cash in one of his accounts. and thrown the Callaways off the property before lunch. Instead, Solomon Hartwell drove 200 miles in his 10-year-old sedan, completely alone, in the best suit he owned, a gray suit, well-pressed, but visibly years out of fashion, the suit of a man who saw no earthly reason to replace something that still worked just fine. He had thought long and hard about what to bring. The Callaways' gift registry had items on it that cost more than the entire house Solomon grew up in. Crystal, silver, a honeymoon to a private island. Solomon ignored every bit of it. He brought a small box, wrapped in plain brown paper, the kind you tear off a grocery bag, tied with a piece of kitchen twine. He had wrapped it himself, at his kitchen table. The night before, his big rough hands worked the paper slowly, and he wept while he did it. Alone, in the house where Eleanor had died, inside that box was the $19 ring, and folded around it, Elera, in his own handwriting. It said this, Mi imani. This ring cost me $19 in 1986, and it is the most valuable thing I own. Your mother wore it for 31 years, not because it was worth anything, but because of what it meant. She asked me, before she left us, to give it to you. When you found a man who would love you, if you had nothing in this world, I have watched you, my girl, and I have prayed over this. And today, I give you her ring. Wear it, knowing exactly where you come from. You are not what they call you. You are what God made you. And God does not make junk. All my love. Forever. Daddy. And there was one more thing inside that box. A single brass key. And a slip of paper with an address written on it. Because Solomon had quietly bought the young couple a small starter house near Imani's school. Nothing grand. A modest place with a porch and a yard. The kind of first home he and Eleanor never got to have. He had put the deed in Imani's name alone. It was his way of giving, without revealing. A gift a simple trucking man might plausibly scrape together, a roof over his daughter's head. No strings, and no fanfare. He had no idea that the man his daughter was about to marry would call that gift garbage and throw it in a fountain. So Solomon Hartwell parked his old sedan at the far end of the gravel lot, wedged between a Bentley and a Range Rover, and he walked up that long, oak-lined drive toward the lawn. A 64-year-old black man in a years-old gray suit, carrying a small box wrapped in a torn-up grocery bag. Coming to give his only daughter the one thing her dying mother had asked him to give her. The valets looked at his car, and then looked at him, and exchanged a glance. The first guest who saw him coming, a woman in a wide-brimmed hat, holding a glass of champagne, actually stopped talking, mid-sentence, and stared. The way you would stare at a man who had clearly wandered into the wrong life entirely. And up near the head of the lawn, surrounded by his groomsmen, holding court in a custom tuxedo that cost more than most of his fiancé's students' families earned in 3 months. Preston Calloway turned. He saw the old man in the cheap suit, walking up the drive of Belcourt, and he felt his stomach drop, with the particular horror of a man whose perfect day has just been contaminated. "Oh, you have got to be kidding me," Preston said. Preston handed his champagne to his best man and started across the lawn fast. The way you move toward a problem, you intend to crush before anyone important notices it. His best man, Brett Donovan, 30 years old, another senior vice president at Meridian Sterling, Preston's old college roommate and the man who had gotten him the job interview in the first place, followed 2 steps behind. He was already grinning. He was already pulling out his phone. Because Brett Donovan had a 6th sense for other people's humiliation and a nasty habit of recording it. Solomon Hartwell was maybe 40 feet onto the lawn when Preston reached him. Hey, where do you think you're going? Solomon stopped. He looked at the young man. At the son-in-law he barely knew. At the polished jaw and the contempt already curling the corner of his mouth. And he answered the way. He answered everything. Quietly, with a stillness that most people found unnerving. And that Preston, in his arrogance, completely mistook for weakness. Preston, good to see you. I'm here for Imani. I brought her something. He lifted the small brown paper box a few inches. It was almost a shy gesture. I won't be any trouble at all. Preston looked at the box. He looked at the suit. He looked at the scuffed shoes. And the rough hands. And the old black man, standing on the lawn of Belcourt, holding a present wrapped in butcher paper and kitchen string, while 300 of the most important people in the Low Country slowly turned to look. And Preston Calloway made the calculation that men like Preston Calloway have been making for 400 years. This man is nothing. This man can do nothing to me. And this man is embarrassing me. That was when he said it. That was when he stepped into the old man's space and snapped his fingers in the air and said the words you already heard at the start of this story. He called him a dirty old black beggar. He sneered at the brown grocery bag. He told him his cheap skin did not belong anywhere near the high-class guests. He told him he probably drove a forklift for a living. And he called for security to drag the clown out of there. The cruelty of it landed on that lawn like a slap across the face. Even a few of the Calloway guests shifted. Uncomfortable. But nobody said anything. 300 people. And not one of them said a single word. The string quartet kept right on playing on the veranda. The same soft, pretty music. While a man humiliated his own future father-in-law in front of all of them, Solomon Hartwell stood very still. There was no anger in his face. There was something far more dangerous than anger, though Preston was far too foolish to recognize it. There was patience, the bottomless, weaponized patience of a man who had spent 64 years being underestimated by smaller men and had built $3 billion on the back of it. I'll stand in the back, Solomon said quietly. I won't be in a single photograph. You won't even know I'm here. I just want to watch my daughter get married. I want to give her this. He lifted the box again. It was her mother's. Eleanor asked me to. I don't care what it was. Preston's voice cracked across the lawn. God, are you even listening to me? I don't care about your sad little box. I don't care about Eleanor. I don't care about your sob story. You are not standing anywhere at my wedding. You are leaving. Right now. And then he snapped his fingers a second time. Actually snapped his fingers. At 2 members of the estate's security staff standing near the garden entrance. He told them this gentleman was leaving. And to walk him out, the 2 security guards hesitated. They were big men in black suits. Hired muscle. And even they could feel that something was wrong about this. The way you can feel the weather changing before the storm hits. One of them, the older one, looked at Solomon, and an apology was already forming in his eyes. Sir, I think there might be a misunderstanding here. Did I ask you to think Preston wheeled on him? I asked you to do the one thing you are being paid to do. Get him out. Now, and so they did. They took Solomon Hartwell by the arms, one on each side, gently at first, the older one murmuring, "This way, sir. I'm sorry." And they began to walk him backward off the lawn of Belcourt. A 64-year-old man, the founder of a 40,000-person company, a man worth $3 billion, being escorted off a former plantation like a trespasser, while 300 wealthy guests watched in total silence, and a string quartet played on. Solomon did not resist. He did not pull away, did not raise his voice, did not say a single word in his own defense. He let himself be walked backward, his eyes scanning the crowd, not for help, but the way they always scanned, taking the measure of the room, reading every single face. He saw the guests who looked away. He saw the ones who watched with naked curiosity, as if this were part of the entertainment they had been promised. And he saw the small handful, only a handful, who looked ashamed. And he saw, near the front, frozen in a pale blue bridesmaid's dress, with her hand pressed over her mouth, a young woman who knew exactly who he was, Renee Okafor, his daughter's best friend. Imani's maid of honor. Renee Okafor's hand came down from her mouth, and it was holding her phone, and the phone was pointed at Preston Calloway, and the small red dot was already recording. It was right in the middle of all of this. Solomon being walked backward, the crowd silent, Renee filming, that the brown paper box slipped. Maybe the guard's grip jostled his arm. Maybe Solomon's hands, for the first time in this entire ordeal, finally betrayed him. The box tipped out of his grasp. And Solomon Hartwell, a man who had not flinched when they grabbed him, who had not flinched when Preston spat on his dead wife's name, lunged for it. It was the only loss of composure he showed the entire afternoon. Because that box was Eleanor. He missed. The box hit the marble lip of the fountain and split open on the stone. The letter spilled out onto the grass. The brass key bounced and skittered away. And the $19 gold band? The ring Eleanor Brooks had worn for 31 years. The ring she had pressed into Solomon's hand 2 days before she died. The ring she had begged him, with her last strength, to give their daughter, rolled across the marble and dropped, with one small, final sound, into the muddy water of the fountain. Solomon stopped breathing. Preston walked over. He looked down at the split-open box, the letter on the grass, the ripples closing over the ring. And he laughed. He nudged the handwritten letter with the toe of his $500 shoe. And he picked up the brass key and tossed it carelessly into the bushes. And he peered into the fountain at the gold band, glinting under the dirty water. And he turned to Brett, who was capturing every second of it on his phone. And the two of them laughed together like boys pulling the wings off something small. "Leave it in the mud," Preston said. "It's junk, just like him." And then he turned his back, and he walked away toward the lieutenant governor, brushing off his hands, as if he had just touched something filthy. And here is where the smallest, most important thing in this entire story happened. The thing the cameras almost missed, the thing that, in the end, mattered more than the cars that were about to come up that drive. An old man, in a server's vest, stepped forward. His name was Daniel Pierce. He was 68 years old, and he had worked banquets at Belcourt for 31 years, long enough that he had carried trays across that very lawn for people who, 2 generations back, would have owned a man like him outright on that exact ground. He had spent 3 decades being invisible at events like this, pouring the wine, clearing the plates, being looked straight through by people exactly like Preston Calloway. He knew, better than anyone else on that lawn, precisely what it cost to step out of being invisible. He stepped out of it anyway. Daniel Pierce walked across the grass, past the frozen guests, past the altar, and he stopped in front of Solomon Hartwell. And he did not say anything clever or brave. He simply took off his own service jacket, and he draped it gently over the older man's shoulders. The way you cover someone you respect, the way you cover someone who is cold. Then he knelt down, slowly, his knees, not what they used to be, and he gathered the spilled letter up off the grass and dug the brass key out of the bushes where Preston had thrown it, and he placed them both carefully back into Solomon's hands. "I've got these for you, Sir," Daniel Pierce said quietly. Just that, Sir. The single word Preston Calloway had refused to give a billionaire, handed over freely by a banquet server who had nothing in the world to gain and a job to lose. Solomon Hartwell looked at this man, this old man in his shirt sleeves, who had just risked his entire livelihood to hand a stranger back his dignity. And something moved across the founder's face that had not moved through any of the rest of it. Not when they grabbed him. Not when the ring went into the water. "Now, what's your name?" Solomon asked. "Daniel." "Sir, Daniel Pierce." "Daniel Pierce," Solomon repeated. The way a man repeats a name he fully intends to keep. "I won't forget this. Now let me stop the story right here. For just 1 second. Because I need you to do something for me. I need you to imagine that the old man on that lawn is your father. Imagine the man who raised you, who clipped coupons so you could have a future, who buried the love of his life and still got up the next morning and went to work. Imagine him standing on a lawn full of strangers, held by the arms, like a criminal, watching the only thing your dead mother left behind sink into a fountain, while a rich kid in a tuxedo calls him a beggar and laughs in his face. And 300 people just watch and say nothing. What would you do? Would you stand up? Or would you look down at your plate? Because somebody at that wedding was about to stand up, and she was wearing a wedding dress. Imani Hartwell, Imani Brooks, to everyone on that lawn, had been inside the mansion, in the bridal suite, in her mother's altered wedding dress, her hands shaking with the ordinary terror of a woman about to be married. And that is where Renee Okafor found her. Renee came through the door without knocking, white-faced, holding out her phone. "Imani, you need to see this. Right now, before you walk out there. Renee, I'm about to walk down the aisle. Now." Imani, Renee pressed play. Imani Hartwell watched 22 seconds of video. She watched 2 security guards hold her father by the arms. She watched her mother's ring drop into a fountain. She watched the man she was supposed to marry in 40 minutes nudge her father's handwritten letter with his shoe, throw the key to their first house into the bushes, and tell 300 people to get this beggar off his lawn. And she watched her father's face. That was the part that broke her. Not Preston's cruelty. Her father's face, the stillness of it, the way he did not fight, did not beg, did not crumble, the way he just stood there and took it, and in one terrible rush, she understood something she had never let herself understand before, that he had probably been taking things exactly like this his entire life. In 1,000 rooms she had never been allowed into, and had never once told her, because he had spent 64 years making sure his daughter never had to know how the world really saw a man like her father. Imani Hartwell did not cry. Later, people would remark on that, how the bride came out of that mansion with dry eyes, and a straight back, and something in her face that made grown men step out of her way. She walked out of the bridal suite in her mother's wedding dress. She walked down the grand staircase. She walked out onto the lawn of Belcourt, the train of her dress dragging across the grass behind her. And 300 guests turned and gasped at how beautiful the bride was. And the string quartet swelled into the processional, and Preston Calloway turned with his magazine advertisement smile already locked in place. And Imani Hartwell walked straight past him. She walked past her groom, past the altar, past the lieutenant governor, all the way across the entire length of that lawn, to where 2 security guards still stood, holding her 64-year-old father by the arms. "Let go of my father," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried the exact way her father's voice carried, the way her grandmother, Ruth's voice, had carried before them both, a quiet that cut through noise like a blade. The security guards let go of him instantly. Imani Hartwell stood in front of her father, in her dead mother's wedding dress, and she looked up at him, and Solomon Hartwell looked down at his daughter, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all. And then Imani turned around, slowly, and she faced the 300 guests, and she faced Preston Calloway, standing, dumbstruck at the altar, and she spoke. "This man," she said, and her voice rang out clear, across the lawn of that former plantation, "is Solomon Hartwell. He is my father. He raised me by himself after my mother died. He drove 200 miles today, alone, in a 10-year-old car, in his best suit, to bring me my mother's wedding ring." She pointed at the fountain, at the water still rippling. "That ring is sitting in that fountain right now, because the man I was about to marry threw it in there. And then he called my father a beggar, in front of every single one of you." She turned to Preston. "You wanted to know who he is." Her voice dropped, and somehow that made it worse, made it land twice as hard. "You said it. You said you knew exactly who he was. You don't. You don't know the first thing about who this man is. But you are about to." She slipped her engagement ring off her finger. "I am not marrying you. Preston, I would not marry you if you were the last man left alive on this earth. Because my mother told me. She told me my entire life to find a man who would love me if I had nothing. And I just watched you find out exactly how you treat people you think have nothing." She set the engagement ring down on the marble lip of the fountain, right beside the muddy water where her mother's ring lay. "There is your ring. It is worth more money than the one you just threw away. And money is the only thing you have ever known how to measure. So keep it." The lawn went dead silent. And then, from down at the bottom of that long, oak-lined drive, came the low, heavy sound of engines. 3 black sedans came up the drive of Belcourt, slow and heavy, gravel popping under the tires, because Solomon Hartwell had made one phone call from the back of that lawn. Just one. He had not called the police. He had not called a lawyer. While he was being walked off the property, while his daughter's ring was sinking into that fountain, Solomon Hartwell had taken his old flip phone out of his jacket pocket, and he had dialed the one number he had dialed 10,000 times in 30 years. And he had said 6 words to the man who answered, "Marcus, I'm at Belcour. Come now." That was all. Marcus Aldridge had been at the Charleston offices of the Meridian Sterling Group, 90 minutes away. He had not asked a single question, because when Solomon Hartwell said the word "come," in that voice, "You came." The 3 sedans stopped near the head of the drive. The doors opened. Marcus Aldridge got out of the lead car. President and Chief Executive Officer of the Meridian Sterling Group, 58 years old, immaculate, in a dark suit that fit the way only real money fits. A man whose face appeared in business magazines and on the wall of every Meridian Sterling building in the country. The one face the entire company actually knew. Behind him came the company's general counsel, the head of corporate security, and 2 members of the executive board, all of them moving with the unmistakable urgency of people who have just learned that the single most important person in their entire world is in trouble. And at the altar, Preston Calloway's blood ran cold, because Preston Calloway recognized Marcus Aldridge. Of course he did. Marcus Aldridge was the chief executive of the company Preston worked for. Marcus Aldridge had spoken at Preston's onboarding. Preston had once waited 40 minutes in a hallway just for the chance to shake Marcus Aldridge's hand at a corporate retreat, and had bragged about it for a week afterward. And Marcus Aldridge, the chief executive of the Meridian Sterling Group, walked straight across the lawn of Belcourt, past 300 stunned guests, past the altar, past a paralyzed Preston Calloway, who managed to choke out, Mr. Aldridge, "Sir, what are you doing here?" And Marcus Aldridge did not so much as glance at him. Marcus Aldridge walked to the old black man in the second-hand gray suit, standing by the fountain. And Marcus Aldridge, the most powerful executive most of these guests had ever seen in person, stopped in front of that old man, and he bowed his head. "Mr. Hartwell," his voice was tight with emotion, "Sir, are you all right? I came as fast as I could. What happened here?" His eyes swept the scene. The split open box, the letter on the grass, the bride standing out of place, the groom frozen, and the gold ring glinting under the muddy water of the fountain. 300 people heard the word "sir." 300 people heard the chief executive of a fortune-tier company call the beggar Mr. Hartwell, and you could feel the entire lawn tilt sideways. Marcus Aldridge followed Solomon's gaze to the fountain. And then Marcus Aldridge, in his $3,000 suit, in front of 300 of the wealthiest people in the entire Low Country, walked to the edge of that marble fountain, rolled up his right sleeve, knelt down in the mud at the base of it, and plunged his arm into the dirty water. He came up with the $19 ring. He dried it, with infinite care, on a clean white handkerchief from his breast pocket, and he placed it, gently, into Solomon Hartwell's open palm, and he closed the old man's fingers over it, the same exact way Eleanor had. All those years ago. Then Marcus Aldridge turned around, still down on one knee in the mud, and he looked up at 300 speechless guests. He found Preston Calloway's white face in the crowd, and his voice, when it finally came, was the cold, controlled fury of a man who has just learned that someone he would trample the world to protect had been spat on. "For those of you who do not know," Marcus Aldridge said, and clearly. Some of you do not. This is Solomon Hartwell. He is the founder and the executive chairman of the Meridian Sterling Group. He built it from a single truck. He owns a controlling interest in a company that employs 40,000 people across 31 states. Marcus rose slowly to his feet, his ruined suit dripping, his eyes locked on Preston. He is my employer. He is my mentor. And he is, by a margin, I cannot even begin to describe to you, the finest man I have ever known in my life. He let that sit there, and then he turned, fully, to face Preston Calloway. And the temperature on that lawn dropped 20 degrees. And you, Marcus said softly, are Preston Calloway, Senior Vice President, Corporate Development, Employee Badge number 4471. You work for me. A pause. Surgical and slow. You work for him. Preston Calloway's legs stopped working. It hit him all at once. The way the ground comes up to meet you when you fall. The little trucking company was Meridian Sterling. The old man in the cheap suit was the chairman. The beggar he had just had dragged off the lawn. The man whose dead wife's ring he had thrown in a fountain and called junk. The father. He had told 300 people not to let embarrass his bride. That man owned the company, owned Preston's job, owned Preston's title, owned the desk, the salary, the career, the entire glittering future that Preston Calloway had built his whole identity around. And Preston had looked him directly in the face, twice, and seen a meter reader. This was the 43rd minute. Exactly 43 minutes after Preston Calloway snapped his fingers and called for security. And his entire world was now over. Oh God, Preston whispered. Oh my God. Mr. Hartwell. Sir. I didn't. I had no idea. I didn't know who you were. And there it was. The whole thing. In one sentence, Solomon Hartwell finally spoke. And when he did, his voice was not loud. And it was not cruel. And that made it land harder than any scream ever could have. He took one step toward Preston Calloway. The $19 ring closed tight in his fist. And he said the thing that was the entire point, the thing this whole story had been walking toward from the very first second. That is the part you keep saying. So, I didn't know who you were. Like that is the problem. Like the sin was that you failed to realize I was rich. Solomon shook his head slowly. You think the lesson here is that you should have been nicer to me because I happen to own the company. You still don't understand. You will probably never understand. He looked out. Then, not at Preston, but at all 300 of them, the senators and the bankers and the silver-haired aristocracy of a world built on the backs of men who looked just like him, standing on a lawn that had been a plantation, who had watched a man dragged across it, and said nothing. You want to know who I am, Solomon said. I will tell you exactly who I am. 40 minutes ago, before any of you knew about the company, before this man got down in the mud and finally said my name, I was a 64-year-old black man in an old suit, carrying a present wrapped in a paper bag, trying to give my daughter her mother's ring. That is all I was. To every single one of you, and not one person on this lawn, not one, said, stop. Not one of you said, that is a human being. You cannot do that to a human being. His voice did not rise. It deepened. You only care who I am now because of what is sitting in my bank account. But I was the exact same man 40 minutes ago. The exact same man. The only thing that has changed is that now you know I can hurt you. He turned back to Preston. That is the difference between us. So, I do not measure a man by the suit he is wearing. I learned a long time ago that you measure a man by how he treats the people he is absolutely certain can do nothing for him. By how he acts when he believes there is no one watching who matters. And I just watched you, in front of everyone, find out exactly who you are. Solomon opened his hand and looked down at the worn gold band in his palm. My wife wore this for 31 years. She married me when I had $19 and a head full of numbers. And she told me she was not betting on my money. She was betting on my character. You had a chance to marry a woman exactly like that today, and you threw her mother's ring into a fountain because the man holding it was wearing the wrong suit. The silence on that lawn was the loudest thing any of those 300 people had ever heard in their lives. Imani crossed the grass and took her father's arm, and Solomon Hartwell, holding his dead wife's ring in one hand and his daughter on the other, turned his back on Preston Calloway. En belle cour. On all 300 of them. And he began to walk away. But the story does not end on that lawn, because Solomon Hartwell had built something over 40 years. And a man who builds something does not simply walk away when he has been wronged. He fixes the system that allowed it to happen in the first place. And what Solomon Hartwell did next is the part that mattered most of all. Preston Calloway was terminated for cause by the close of business Monday. It was Marcus Aldridge who signed the paperwork, but it was Solomon Hartwell who made the decision, and he made it not out of revenge, though God knows he was entitled to it, but out of something colder and far more permanent. Because here is what Solomon Hartwell understood that Preston never would. A man who behaves like that on a lawn, in front of 300 witnesses, in front of cameras, is a man who has behaved like that 1,000 times before, in every room where he believed no one important was watching. So before he fired him, Solomon ordered an audit. He had the company's general counsel and an outside investigative firm pull every record connected to Preston Calloway's 4 years at the Meridian Sterling Group, every email, every performance review Preston had written, every hiring decision, every promotion he had blocked, and every complaint that had ever been filed against him. And what they found turned a personal humiliation into a full corporate reckoning. There were 11 internal complaints against Preston Calloway. 11 filed over 4 years by employees in 3 different states. A black project manager had been passed over for a promotion she was unanimously recommended for. The file showed Preston had personally intervened to give it to a less qualified friend, with a note, an actual written note, that the company needed someone who fit the room a little better. A Latino logistics supervisor had been written up 4 times in 6 months for infractions that his white colleagues committed openly, every day, with absolutely no consequence. The pattern was so blatant that the investigators flagged it within the first hour. A young black analyst had filed a formal complaint about a comment Preston made in a meeting, a comment ugly enough that 2 other people in that room had corroborated it in writing. And that complaint had been quietly closed, marked, resolved, no action, and buried. Buried by whom? That was the thread that unraveled the entire thing. Because the complaints against Preston Calloway had not just been ignored, they had been made to disappear. Methodically, by a senior director in human resources named Gavin Wexler, a man who had been at the company 11 years, who had built his whole career on being useful to the right people, and who had made a quiet little specialty out of protecting executives like Preston Calloway and Brett Donovan. In exchange for their loyalty and their referrals, 11 complaints had crossed Gavin Wexler's desk, and Gavin Wexler had made all 11 of them go away. And the people who had filed them, almost every single one of them, black or brown, had learned the oldest and most bitter lesson in America: that you can do everything right, follow every rule, file every form, and still watch the paper with your name on it vanish into a drawer, while the man who hurt you gets promoted. Solomon Hartwell read every page of that audit himself, at his kitchen table, the same table where he had wrapped the ring, and when he finished, he did not slam his fist down. He simply sat very still, for a very long time. And then he picked up the phone. Brett Donovan, the best man, the one who had filmed Solomon's humiliation grinning, the one whose own video footage now sat on his own phone as evidence, was terminated that same week. The investigation found he had been Preston's partner in 2 of the 11 incidents. Gavin Wexler was terminated, and his name was referred, along with the full audit, to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and to a team of civil rights attorneys, because burying discrimination complaints is not just unethical, depending on what you knew and what you covered up. It can be a crime. And then it went public. Because of course it went public. Renee Okafor's 22-second video had hit the internet on Saturday night. By Sunday morning, it had 2 million views. By Monday, the same day Preston was fired, it had 9 million. And the headline that traveled with it, across every platform and every news desk in the country, was as undeniable as the footage itself. Executive calls Billionaire founder a beggar. Has him dragged off his own daughter's wedding? Not knowing the old man owns the entire company. It played on every network. It generated 10,000 opinion pieces. And the single most quoted line out of all of it was not the cruelty. It was Solomon's reply. The line a reporter pulled from a guest's recording, and that ran under his photograph on 100 million screens. You only care who I am now because of what is in my bank account. But I was the exact same man 40 minutes ago, because that line was never really about Solomon Hartwell at all. It was about every single man and woman watching who had ever been the beggar on somebody's lawn, every person who had been followed in a store, ignored at a counter, talked down to in a lobby, passed over for the promotion, written up for the exact thing the other guy got away with. Every person who knew, deep in their bones, that the world had looked right at them and seen a meter reader, a verklift driehoek, a paper bag. Solomon Hartwell had given all of them words for it, and the entire country could not stop repeating those words back. Now here is the difference between a man who wants revenge and a man who wants change. Revenge ends with the firing. Revenge would have been perfectly satisfied watching Preston Calloway lose his job, and his reputation, and his bride, Al, in one single weekend. And make no mistake, Preston lost every bit of all 3. But Solomon Hartwell had spent his entire life learning a harder truth, that punishing the man who hurt you does absolutely nothing to protect the next person from the next man. You do not change anything by removing one Preston Calloway. There is always another one coming up the ladder right behind him. You change things by changing the ladder itself. So Solomon Hartwell, 64 years old, came out of 40 years of self-imposed shadow, and he walked back into his own company, in person. And the 40,000 people who had never once seen the chairman's face finally got to meet him. He stood up in the main atrium of the Meridian Sterling headquarters in Charleston, in a gray suit, only slightly newer than the one he had worn to the wedding. And he addressed the entire company by broadcast, every office, in all 31 states. And he told them the truth, all of it. He told them what had happened on that lawn. He told them about the 11 complaints. He told them about Gavin Wexler and the drawer where good people's pain had been sent to die. He did not soften it, and he did not spin it. I built this company on one single promise. He said, my mother made it to me before she made it to anyone else. You are not what they call you. You are what God made you. I have spent 40 years putting my name on bridges and ports and 40,000 paychecks. And the whole time I was doing that, somewhere inside this company, people who looked like me were filing complaints, and somebody was throwing them in a drawer. That happened on my watch. That is my failure. And I am going to spend whatever time I have left on this earth making sure it never happens on anybody's watch again. And what he did next was not a press release. It was permanent. He instituted a true zero-tolerance discrimination policy across the entire Meridian Sterling Group. Not the toothless kind that lives in a handbook nobody ever reads. The kind with an independent ethics ombudsman who reported directly to the board and who could not be fired by any executive. No matter how senior, every complaint in every state would now be logged in a system that no Gavin Wexler could ever touch, tracked by case number, reviewed by an outside monitor. No complaint could be marked resolved without documented proof of what was actually done about it. The drawer was nailed shut forever. He restructured the company's promotion and hiring review so that the patterns that audit had caught, the qualified black manager passed over, the Latino supervisor written up for nothing, would now get flagged automatically by the numbers before another career could be quietly strangled in the dark. He brought back the project manager Preston had blocked. He promoted her himself, and he put her on the very committee that would oversee the new system. The man who had been the beggar made absolutely certain the woman who had been passed over got the corner office. And then he did the thing Eleanor would have loved the most. He founded the Eleanor Brooks Hartwell Foundation, and he endowed it, in a single stroke, with $250 million of his own money. Its mission was the one closest to his heart and to his wife's: scholarships, mentorship, and a real, paved path forward for first-generation students from exactly the kind of tin-roofed, wrong side of the tracks, places that Solomon Hartwell himself had been born into. The children that the Prestons of the world look right at and see nothing. And every scholarship came with the same letter, in Solomon's own handwriting, the same words his mother had pressed into him, and that he had pressed into his daughter. You are not what they call you. You are what God made you. And God does not make junk. The foundation funded music programs. 2. Instruments and teachers for schools exactly like the one where a music teacher named Imani Brooks had been putting violins into the hands of children who had been told their whole lives that they would never make anything beautiful. And Imani did not quit teaching. She still has not To this day, the daughter of a billionaire still shows up at 7:40 every single morning to a public school where half the kids qualify for free lunch because some inheritances are worth so much more than money. And Solomon Hartwell had already given his daughter the only one that ever truly mattered. There was one more moment in all of this. A quiet one. Nobody filmed it, and almost nobody heard about it. But the young analyst who had been silenced years earlier says she will carry it with her to her grave. She was the one whose ugly meeting complaint had been buried, marked resolved, no action, and dropped in the drawer. For 4 years, she had believed, the way they always make you believe, that she had simply been too sensitive, too difficult, too much, that the problem had been her. And then the audit found her complaint, and the corroborating statements, and the exact date it was buried, and the name of the man who had buried it, in a deposition room. Months later, under oath, with the company's lawyers finally sitting on her side of the table instead of against her, she got to say the thing out loud at last. What had happened? What was said? How it felt to file the form, and then watch it vanish. How it felt to keep coming into work every day after that, and smile at the man who had made her disappear. When she finished, the attorney slid a single sheet of paper across the table to her. It was her original complaint, the one she had been told, for 4 years, did not exist, did not matter, had been handled. It existed. It had her own handwriting on it. It had been real the entire time. I sat there, and I cried. She told a reporter. Much later, not because of what he did to me, because for 4 years, they made me think I had imagined the whole thing. And there it was, on paper. Proof that I was not crazy. Proof that it actually happened. Do you understand what that is worth? To a person. To finally be believed. That sheet of paper is what Solomon Hartwell's $3 billion actually bought, not revenge. Proof. A drawer pulled open at last. And every person inside of it finally told the truth. You were not imagining it. It was real. And it will never go in a drawer again. Preston Calloway lost everything. And he lost it fast. He was fired for cause, which meant his unvested stock options, millions of dollars he had already spent in his head, evaporated overnight. He was named in 2 federal actions and a civil suit. His engagement was over. Imani never spoke to him again. And the Calloway name, that old money armor the family had polished for 150 years, turned out to be no protection at all against 9 million people who had watched him do it with their own eyes. His father, the state senator, quietly declined to seek re-election. The invitations stopped coming. The kind of people who used to fight to have Preston at their table now crossed entire rooms to avoid being photographed standing next to him. He gave one interview, months later, in which he used the word mistake 11 times, and the phrase, I didn't know who he was, 3 more. And the whole country watched it and understood with total clarity that Preston Calloway still, even now, even after all of it, believed his sin was failing to recognize a rich man. He had learned nothing. And that, in the end, was his real sentence. Not the money, not the job, the simple fact that he would go through the entire rest of his life never once understanding what he had actually done, Brett Donovan lost his career and moved out of state. Gavin Wexler's case is still working its way through the courts. The Calloway family quietly sold off some of their holdings. And Belcourt, the former plantation, is no longer in business as a wedding venue at all. The owners cited reputational concerns, which is a very polite way of saying that nobody on earth wanted their wedding photos taken on the lawn where the entire country had just watched a good man get dragged across the grass. And Daniel Pierce, the banquet server, 68 years old, who took off his own jacket and knelt down in front of a stranger and called him Sir 6 weeks later. Daniel Pierce received a letter offering him a position, full benefits, double his salary, a real pension, hand signed by the chairman himself. The note attached to it said only this: "You were the one who stood up. Daniel Pierce took the job. He still has it. Some debts a man pays for the rest of his life, and counts himself the lucky one for getting the chance." And Solomon Hartwell. Solomon Hartwell went back to his modest brick house outside Charleston. He still drives the 10-year-old sedan, though Marcus keeps threatening to buy him a new one, and Solomon keeps telling him to mind his own business. He still wears his suits until the elbows go. He stepped back from the day-to-day running of Meridian Sterling once again. Once the new systems were locked into place, and that drawer was nailed shut for good. And he handed the company back to Marcus Aldridge. And the two of them have dinner together once a month at a little diner near the office, where the waitress knows their order by heart, and where neither one of them has ever once mentioned that one of them is worth $3 billion. He kept the $19 ring. He had it cleaned, gently, by a jeweler who offered to replace the worn-down gold for free, and was politely, firmly told no. That wear is 31 years of a marriage. You will not touch it. And he kept it in the small velvet box on his dresser, right next to a photograph of Eleanor, until the day, a year and a half later, that Imani brought a man home. His name was David. He was a high school history teacher who coached the debate team. On the side, he drove a car almost as old as Solomon's, and he had no idea, for the first 6 months that he dated Imani Brooks, that her father was a billionaire, because Imani, who was Eleanor's daughter, and Ruth's granddaughter, and Solomon's child, told him exactly nothing. And she watched, and she waited, the way her father had taught her, to see how a man treats the people he is absolutely certain can do nothing for him. David passed. David passed in 100 small, quiet ways, over 100 ordinary days, not one of which he ever knew was a test. And on the evening, Imani finally told him the truth. The company, the 40,000 employees, the $3 billion. David sat very still for a long moment. And then he said, "Okay, that doesn't change a single thing about how I feel about you. But I have to be honest with you. It is going to be really, really hard to win an argument with you about money. Now," and Imani laughed, all the way, for the first time since the lawn. When David asked Solomon Hartwell for his daughter's hand, Solomon took the small velvet box down off his dresser. He opened it. He looked at the $19 ring his wife had worn for 31 years. The ring his mother-in-law had blessed on the steps of a church. The ring a rich man had once called junk and thrown into a fountain. And Solomon Hartwell placed it in the palm of a high school history teacher who drove a 10-year-old car, and he closed the young man's fingers over it. Her mother wore this for 31 years. Solomon said, "She married me when I had $19 and a head full of numbers. And she told me she was not betting on my money. She was betting on my character." He gripped the young man's hand hard. "You give this to my daughter, and you remember exactly what it is worth. Not the gold, what it means." They were married in the backyard of that modest brick house. Folding chairs. 40 people. Imani wore her mother's dress one more time. There was no string quartet, and no lieutenant governor, and no plantation. There was a barbecue, and Imani's students sang, badly and beautifully, a song that she had taught them. And Solomon Hartwell walked his daughter across the grass of an ordinary backyard and gave her away, in a suit, with the elbows worn, clean through. And it was, by every single measure that had ever mattered to anyone in that family, the richest wedding the Low Country had seen in 100 years. Now let me tell you the part that everybody gets wrong about this story. People hear it, and they think the lesson is, be careful who you disrespect, because they just might turn out to be rich. They think the twist is the bank account. They think the moral is that Preston Calloway should have been polite to the old man, because the old man owned the company, and if that is what you take away from this, then you are standing on the exact same lawn Preston was standing on. You are just standing on the other end of it, because Solomon Hartwell told you himself, didn't he? I was the exact same man 40 minutes ago. That is the whole thing. That is the entire point. He was the same man when he was a beggar on that lawn as he was when he was the chairman of the board. The dignity did not get installed the moment Marcus Aldridge knelt down in the mud and said his name. The dignity had been there the whole time. It was there, in the tin-roofed house. It was there, in the back of those empty lecture halls, at 2 in the morning. It was there on the church steps, with a $19 ring. It was there, on that lawn, between 2 security guards, while 300 people watched and a string quartet played. His power was never the $3 billion. The money was just the thing that finally forced the room to see what had been standing right in front of it the entire time. And that is the real tragedy, buried inside this story, that it took $3 billion to make 300 people treat one single man like a human being, that a black man in this country can be a giant, can be a builder of empires, can be the finest man anyone in the room has ever known, and still get dragged across a lawn because he showed up wearing the wrong suit. And not one person says stop. Solomon Hartwell's real strength was not that he was secretly powerful, it was that he never, for one single second, on that lawn or anywhere else in his life, believed the thing they were trying to make him believe about himself. They called him a beggar, and he knew he was Ruth Hartwell's son. They threw his wife's ring in the mud, and he knew exactly what it was worth. They tried to take his dignity, and they could not, because you cannot take a thing from a man who refuses, flatly, completely, all the way down to the bone, to hand it over. You can drag a man across a lawn. You cannot drag him out of himself. And the deepest victory in this entire story is not the firing, and it is not the lawsuit, and it is not even the foundation. As much as all of that matters, the deepest victory is that somewhere out there, right now, there is a child reading a handwritten letter that came along with a scholarship, a letter that says, "You are not what they call you." And that child has never heard the name Solomon Hartwell, and never will. And that child is going to grow up believing the single most important thing a human being can ever believe, that no one on any lawn, anywhere, gets to decide what they are worth. That is what he built. Not the bridges, not the ports, not the 40,000 paychecks. That. Now here is my question for you. The real one, not the easy one. Forget the twist. Forget the $3 billion. Imagine you were one of those 300 guests on that lawn. Before the cars came up the drive, before anybody knew anything, when it was just an old man in a cheap suit being dragged across the grass, while a rich kid in a tuxedo laughed, would you have stood up or would you have looked down at your plate? Be honest with yourself about that, because that exact moment, the one before, you find out the man is important. That is the only test that has ever actually counted. Solomon Hartwell passed it his entire life. Marcus Aldridge passed it the second he hit his knees in the mud. Daniel Pierce passed it with a job on the line and nothing to gain. Imani passed it in her mother's wedding dress. And 300 other people failed it. In complete and total silence. So tell me, down in the comments, which one you would have been, not which one you hope you would be, which one you honestly believe you would be. If it were a real lawn and a real Saturday, and nobody knew yet that any of it mattered, and if this story moved something in you, if you have ever been the person on that lawn, or if you are trying to raise children, who would be the ones to stand up? Then do me one favor. Hit that like button. So this story reaches one more person who needs to hear that they are not what the world calls them. Share it with somebody who has been made to feel small this week. And subscribe to Black Stories. Because next week there is another story. And another lawn. And another quiet person that the whole world is about to badly, badly underestimate. You measure a man by how he treats the people he is certain can do nothing for him. Go be the one who stands